Akira, demon blood is even more precious than a witch's. Agatha sighed and continued, back in the Federation, during experiments, if a witch's blood is wasted, no one cares. But if they lose demon's blood, reprimands and punishments are inevitable. While preparing the second batch of seals, as Agatha was about to make another cut, Anna stopped her. Anna proposed to use her blood this time. Anna pointed out that manhwa could heal wounds but couldn't replenish blood. His Majesty once said that excessive blood loss could cause dizziness and even fainting. Just as Agatha was about to decline the offer, Anna suggested Agatha rest for 2 days before resuming her work. Telling her to consume more meat porridge and animal liver during this period would speed up recovery. Is this also what His Majesty said? Agatha asked. Anna nodded. Anna knew the purpose of Agatha choosing her as an assistant to learn the methods of magic seal making. She might as well handle these next 2 batches. Agatha remained silent for a moment, then nodded. Back in the castle, Edith took a while to process everything before finally speaking. Roland wouldn't have concocted such an unbelievable tale just to deceive her. She wondered if demons were truly that powerful? Roland nodded. Not only are demons individually powerful, but their numbers are also staggering. Roland's army can easily defeat Timothy's knights, but victory against demons is not guaranteed. They've been slowly growing in strength over the past 400 years. The key point is, there's no possibility of negotiating peace in this war. It won't end until one side is completely eradicated. Edith looked intently at Roland, questioning if Roland has a plan to share this news with the public. Roland shook his head and picked up his teacup. It's inevitable, but not now. Roland is uncertain about how his people would perceive this cold and terrifying enemy. Building their confidence will be a slow process. Edith understands that panic is more fearsome than any enemy. Her final question was about the timeline. How long do they have before this war starts? Roland was uncertain, 5 years, maybe less. No one knows the exact time the red moon will appear. War could break out at any moment. That's why Roland can't afford to methodically unify Greycastle at a leisurely pace. She didn't respond further but stood up from her seat and knelt down on one knee in a knight manner. Given the circumstances, the Khan family is willing to be at your command, Edith said. Your laws will be unhindered in the north, and your will shall be the only voice in the north. She paused. She also hoped that all Roland's promises could be fulfilled. It seemed that Edith was still thinking about the steam engine. Roland smiled, then suggesting that Edith's father might not agree to this. Moreover, how could the Khan family guarantee any of this? Without hesitation, she replied, she will guarantee it herself. Edith confidently said she was willing to stay here. If Roland wants more, her brother Cole could also stay. This would force her father to agree, regardless of his reluctance. Roland looked at the 2 of them. Thinking this was effectively holding them as hostages? That would be an obvious threat in the eyes of the Duke. Edith shook her head, placing her hand on her chest and saluting as if she were a knight. She requested to join the city hall, expressing a desire to witness the new world Roland was planning with her own eyes and to see if this so-called advanced civilization was truly as wonderful as Roland had described. After Edith left, what pleased Roland the most was Edith's oath of allegiance. Nothing was sweeter than more population and resources. If the North truly surrendered as she suggested, the territory he effectively controlled would more than double. If everything went smoothly, he might be able to achieve unification before the month of the demons arrived this year. Soon, Agatha entered the office. Roland said Agatha had worked very hard recently. He then questioned, did the process go smoothly? Agatha calmly stated that the first batch failed twice and Anna participated in part of the production. Agatha placed the end results on the desk and then left. Before leaving, she remarked, if Roland wants more magic seals to be made, please provide her with a spacious laboratory first, not a shabby shelter that looks like a stable. Roland cheerfully responded, he will have the mage tower constructed as soon as possible. Just after Agatha left the office, Nightingale peeked in from behind, curious about the magic seals. Roland grinned, saying these are roughly equivalent to telephones, alarm systems, and cameras. Nightingale shook her head, not understanding a word Roland just said. Roland elaborated. These will be given to Thunder. One seal can help with long-distance communication, another can detect the presence of demons nearby to prevent ambushes, and another seal can assist Thunder with exploration. Roland felt a pang of regret, unable to join the fleet at sea and missing the spectacular yet airy seascapes. A thick fog rose on the sea, and a sailor shouted that they were now approaching a reef zone. Thunder commanded the sailors to lower the sails and proceed at a slow pace, alerting everyone to be on high vigilance. Molly asked Margaret if she could really find the witch they spoke about. Margaret nodded, certain that Joan would not ignore any sailing ship in danger. The last time Margaret saw Joan, her legs had already transformed into the shape of a fish's. However, that was all 10 years ago, and Margaret had no clear idea of her current state. Camilla pondered, if Joan has always been with the sea, then there's no need to worry about her not being able to survive on her awakening day. But since more than a decade has passed, is she really still in this sea area? Thunder walked over, assuring Camilla to trust their intelligence. Ever since Thunder knew Joan became a witch, he's been paying extra attention here. He was aware of some greedy merchants trying to catch her. Thunder blinked, but a shipwreck stopped them. He assured Camilla those guys wouldn't dare to lay a finger on her again. Camilla and Molly thanked Thunder for his help towards the witches. Just then, a sailor reported hearing singing from the northwest direction. Thunder shouted for everyone to be quiet. As everyone held their breath and listened intently, the ethereal and elusive singing gradually became clearer. It didn't come from all directions but firmly pointed in one direction. Just like a ray of light piercing through the dense fog, guiding the ship to a safe course. Thunder, Camilla, Molly, and Margaret boarded a small boat, with Molly's slime protecting the bottom of the boat, and sailed towards the singing. After awakening as a witch, Joan almost never showed her face, knowing that she could not be caught by others. Ships in danger could often only hear her singing, and very few people had seen her. Therefore, Thunder's plan was to have the ship stay in place, continuously attracting Joan singing, while he, Margaret, and the witches took a small boat to find her by following the sound. After sailing in the thick fog for some time, Margaret suddenly saw a figure and couldn't help but shout out her name. The singing abruptly stopped. A woman was seen half floating on the water, looking at the people in the boat in surprise, seemingly at a loss. The boat approached the girl, and Margaret said to her, identifying herself as Margaret, and asked if she remembered her. The girl made intermittent cries while slowly retreating backward. Thunder explained that she could no longer speak and that they would need Camilla's help. Camilla nodded and placed her hand on Margaret's shoulder. In an instant, Joan's voice echoed in her mind. Margaret heard the girl ask if Margaret had brought them here to capture her. Margaret was about to say that wasn't the case when Camilla interrupted her, telling Margaret to speak directly in her mind, as heartfelt communication was more sincere. Margaret calmed herself and repeatedly thought about what she wanted to say. She asked the girl if she remembered saving Margaret's life and explained that she was there to seek her help this time. The girl slowly swam out from behind a rock, approaching the boat, and remembered Margaret. They used to spend time together. Margaret was excited, thinking that Camilla's abilities were truly miraculous. Suddenly, the girl withdrew her hand and asked fearfully who Camilla was. Margaret realized that her thoughts could be directly heard by Joan and quickly explained that Camilla was a witch just like Joan, and it was her ability that allowed them to hear each other's thoughts. The girl was still somewhat scared and asked if sailors were here to capture the witches. Margaret shook her head and explained that the church's power had been completely eradicated in the fjord, and now witches were settling in a slumbering isle. If Joan wanted to head over to Slumbering Isle, Margaret was willing to guide her. The girl recalled being attacked with harpoons by the merchant before, thinking those people were after the church's bounty on her. Margaret looked at her seriously and assured her that such things would never happen again because Thunder had taken care of everything, The girl also remembered this name, recognizing it as belonging to a distinguished explorer. The two talked for a long time, while Molly and Thunder whispered to each other, wishing they could hear what was being said. After a long time, Joan let out a soft cry sound, flicked her tail, and dived into the sea, leaving behind a series of ripples. "How did it go?" Thunder asked. Margaret turned around, slowly revealing a smile, saying Joan had agreed to their request. As the carriage entered the city of dawn, the sounds around them suddenly became noisy. York couldn't help but lift the curtain to look outside. A woman's voice came from beside him, asking what his first impression of the Dawn capital was. York smiled and said that it was indeed the merchant capital. Even on the main roads, vendors were openly hawking their wares. If this was happening in Grey Castle, all of them would have been chased away by the guards. He added that only the fjords could compare to this place. Hearing this, the woman laughed a few times, saying that people in the fjords were just a bunch of porters dealing in goods, merely transporting goods from one place to another, selling them at a profit due to scarcity. There weren't many valuable goods that could be sold from the islands. After some thought, she concluded that perhaps only salted fish could bring in some money. York didn't say much, just continued along with the woman's words, praising her for being the most well-known merchant in the capital. She smiled slightly, reached out to put her hand on his shoulder, and said that Mr. Ambassador is also really good at something. York had given the woman a bottle of perfume from Grey Castle as a special product 2 days ago. It had taken him only 2 days to become very close with her, and with another bottle of perfume, he had won her favor. After one night, the two of them were inseparable. York then asked what the most popular business in Dawn City was. The woman whispered in York's ear that there were 2 types of goods that sold well in the capital. One was practical items that were needed most of the time, but not too common, such as crystal glasses, silver mirrors, perfumes, high-quality fabrics, and textiles. The other type was novelty items, which had no standard price and depended entirely on whether the buyer liked them or not. If York was interested, she was willing to take him to visit the top exhibitions. However, she also mentioned that recently there was a business that was even better than those. The woman, her name is Denise, paused for a moment and said, "Slave trade." York thought for a moment, knowing this was a common phenomenon. The female merchant explained that businesses without capital were always the most popular. When the Wolfheart Kingdom was occupied by the church, tens of thousands of refugees flooded in. As long as they were given some food, they could be recruited in droves and it would be profitable to sell them anywhere. The woman looked out of the window and said that she didn't quite like the feeling of buying and selling people as slaves, especially women. York wrapped his arms around her, telling her not to think about these things. A business like that did not mean it was risk-free. When those refugees turned into a mob, the slave traders would have a headache. Just as they were about to get intimate, the coachman mentioned that they had arrived at the royal district. York politely declined the woman's invitation to visit her home and got off the carriage. He thought to himself that since Denise was a married woman, and now that they were in her husband's territory, visiting her mansion would be a huge risk. If her husband found out, he could end up severely beaten. Seeing York getting off the carriage, Hill, who was following the merchant convoy, slowly approached. Hill, York's personal guard assigned by King Roland himself, came to his side and smiled, saying that York truly lived up to his reputation as the magic hand. Hill then asked what they had talked about over the past few days. York said they were just talking about businesses. Although Hill didn't seem like a powerful knight in York's eyes, he had reportedly made many contributions to King Roland. When asked about his plans, York said with pride, "Raise the national flag, submit the documents, and let them know that the ambassador from Grey Castle has arrived." A grand banquet was arranged in the royal palace's grand hall. This was the first time York had attended a banquet of such high standard. Of course, what attracted York's attention the most were the noble ladies mingling among the men. A young man, surrounded by a crowd, walked up to him. He was the host of the banquet, the first prince, Anpian Moa. York quickly performed a chest salute, and Anpian mentioned that he had read the letter of introduction and documents on behalf of the King of Grey Castle. However, he explained that his father was very ill, which was why he couldn't personally attend York, expressing his regrets. Anpian sighed, stating that this was already common knowledge in Dawn City. A month and a half ago, the king suddenly fainted during a banquet and had not fully recovered since. He could only stay awake for 2 to 3 hours each day, spending the rest of the time in a deep slumber. York thought for a moment. A month and a half was exactly the time it took him to travel from Grey Castle to here. He comforted Anpian, saying, "His Majesty will gradually get better." The prince managed to smile and told York to continue enjoying the banquet, before preparing to leave. Just then, York suddenly remembered his main purpose for being there and quickly mentioned the previous discussions about forming an alliance between the Kingdom of Dawn and Grey Castle. The prince simply stated that he was aware of the situation, but everything had to wait until his father was well again. Not long after, a familiar voice came from behind York. He was startled and turned around quickly, only to find that it was indeed Denise. She raised a glass of red wine and walked towards York with a smile. After the banquet, Otto, following the prince, puzzled, asked the prince why he didn't agree to the alliance immediately. Forming an alliance with Grey Castle was the king's intention, and with the church's power becoming increasingly oppressive, they shouldn't be fighting this battle alone. The prince did not turn around. Instead, he asked whether his father had sent Otto to find Timothy instead of Roland. Otto explained that their ally was meant to be the king of Grey Castle, and the message brought by the ambassador confirmed that Roland was indeed the new king. The prince raised his hand to interrupt Otto, telling him that he had his own plans and that Otto need not worry about this matter any longer. Otto raised his voice, arguing that for the sake of the kingdom's security, they needed someone to restrain the church. Anpian's voice involuntarily rose as he turned around and told Otto that he did not want to repeat himself, instructing Otto to stay out of this matter. Seeing the crown prince so resolute, Otto had no choice but to let it go. Just as he was about to turn away, the prince suddenly called out to him, asking Otto if they were friends. Otto fell silent for a moment before responding yes. Andrea, Belinda, Aro, and himself were all friends of the prince. Anpian then slowly asked if something were to happen to his father, the king, would Otto support him in becoming the new king? Otto fell silent for a moment before finally responding, yes. Otto returned from the palace, confused and disoriented. Ever since the king fell ill, Prince Anpian seemed to be greatly affected. Although he had somewhat recovered recently, his words and actions seemed different from before. To put it precisely, he felt like a stranger. As a childhood friend, Otto believed he understood the prince very well. Anpian was not the kind of person who would resort to unscrupulous measures for power. In fact, Otto sometimes felt that Anpian was somewhat naive and not suitable to be a king who could lead and make important decisions. Because of this, Otto planned to assist his friend in governing the state affairs with all his abilities, along with Belinda and Oro, once Anpian was crowned. The three families had always followed the king closely since the establishment of the Kingdom of Dawn. Therefore, he still answered yes without any hesitation. But Otto realized that Anpian didn't care about his answer. The prince asked out of a habit born from insecurity. And Otto hadn't considered this. End of the day, the three families were willing to support the royal family, but what if the prince didn't need their support? This thought troubled Otto as he contemplated the future of their friendship and the role he and the other families would play in the upcoming reign of Prince Anpian. Realizing this, Otto felt an increasing distance between himself and Anpian. He sighed, thinking that perhaps he should take the initiative to do something. Probably, he alone couldn't do anything. The three families must unite. Only by working together could they possibly find out the reason behind Anpian's actions. Otto didn't go straight home. Instead, he made his way to the Tokat family territory. Aro, taking off his sweaty headband and tossing his wooden sword to a servant, asked why Otto came to find him. Otto pulled Oro aside and shared his thoughts and plans. Oro shook his head. He understood that Anpian was the prince, the heir to the Kingdom of Dawn, and he wouldn't always be their friend. Oro said that they should assist the king only if he needs them, if not, they shouldn't pry into his affairs. Otto just then realized that Oro had already seen this coming. Otto tried his best to persuade, saying their three families had always followed the royal family. Oro laughed cynically and said, "Since Andrea's death, there have been only two of them. Where is the third family?" Otto grabbed Oro's hand and told him, "Andrea is not dead." Oro stopped in his tracks, turned around, and almost pinned Otto to the wall with the force of his movement. Otto couldn't keep this secret any longer. He slowly revealed that he had personally seen Andrea with King Roland back in Grey Castle. Oro's eyes widened, asking if he meant they were together in a romantic sense. Otto bit his lip, saying he wasn't sure, but Andrea had become a witch, and only Roland at the time was willing to shelter a witch. Otto carefully recounted Andrea's experiences, watching the mixed emotions on Oro's face. Both of them had once believed without a doubt the story of the Quinn family saying Andrea's carriage fell off the cliff. After hearing everything, Oro sat down on the ground, his face filled with frustration as he pounded the floor. Otto continued, saying that this was why they needed to bring Prince Anpian back. Oro was obviously unclear about the connection between the two matters. Otto urged him to think it through. By putting the alliance between the two kingdoms on hold and refusing to give a reason, Anpian risked the failure of the plan set by the king to stand united against the church. If the church were to launch an attack, they would have to face it alone. If they attacked the Kingdom of Dawn first, Oro would lead the knights to battle. If Oro were to be defeated and die in battle, he would never see Andrea again. Oro thought about it and seemed to find some logic in Otto's words. However, he then asked why Otto thought he would definitely lose. Ignoring his friend's protests, Otto continued, "If the church attacks Grey Castle first, Roland will have to face the invaders. If Roland loses and dies, Andrea will most likely die by his side. If she gets captured by the church, her fate will be even worse. But if the two kingdoms could support each other, making the church hesitant to make a move, neither of them would have to die on the battlefield. There would still be a chance for Oro to meet Andrea in the future." Otto asked the final question. Is the alliance important or not? At this realization, Oro finally understood. He stood up and their hands gripped tightly together. York dragged his tired yet invigorated body back home. As he pushed open the door to his bedroom, he was taken aback to find a person there, who had already lit the candles. In the flickering candlelight, he recognized that it was indeed Hill who had spoken. Hill explained that nighttime was the only time he could visit without attracting attention, and he had been very cautious in coming here, hoping that York would understand. Hill poured York a cup of tea and then started to explain the situation. A large number of refugees from Wolfheart Kingdom were flooding into the Kingdom of Dawn, presenting an excellent opportunity for recruitment. Hill hoped that York would start treating this as a business venture, focusing primarily on finding craftsmen, individuals who can read and write, and those with some sort of special skills. All the finances would be covered by the king. York was not very knowledgeable in this area, and besides, slave trading mainly occurred at the border between the two kingdoms. As an ambassador, it was not convenient for him to go there. Hill sat down and reassured York that he wouldn't need to leave. Traders would bring the slaves here, and even though the price might be a bit higher, it would save the trouble of screening them. As for not knowing how to conduct business, he could seek help from Denise. She was a well-known noble merchant in the area, and transporting the refugees to Grey Castle wouldn't be a problem for her. York was surprised at how much Hill knew and asked if he had been to the Kingdom of Dawn before. Hill shook his head, explaining that he had gathered this information while York was spending quality time with Lady Denise. York looked at Hill with admiration, commenting that he never realized Hill was not only a skilled knight but also a shrewd businessman. Hill modestly replied that he was neither a knight nor a businessman, but his mission, entrusted to him by the king, was to ensure York's safety at crucial moments. He added with a smile that he was just an ordinary person from an acrobat team. Back in the city of Neverwinter, in the border town, officials and assistants from the municipal hall kept sending various documents and reports to Barav. Under normal circumstances, the busier the municipal hall's work, the happier Barav would feel. However, recently, the situation has become complicated. Just as his assistant left the documents on the desk and closed the door, Edith's voice rang in his ears. Barav groaned inwardly. This young lady had really come down here, and she wasn't even using formal language when addressing him. The king had arranged for Edith to work in the chief officer's office as an assistant, in order to learn about the structure of the municipal hall and the process of handling government affairs. However, it seemed she didn't see it that way. Seeing that Barav seemed overwhelmed, Edith offered to help him with a smile. Reluctantly, Barav nodded in agreement. Given her status as the daughter of the Duke of the Northern Territory, she was indeed of a higher rank than Barav. Even if he felt helpless inside, there was nothing wrong with Edith's words or actions. If Barav outright refused Edith's help and the king heard about it, it would be hard to justify his actions. At such a crucial time, Barav could not afford to leave a bad impression on the king. Soon, the sound of writing filled the room as Edith began to work on the documents. Quickly, she placed the files back on his desk and started to explain. Her voice was clear and well organized, making it hard to believe that she had only joined the municipal hall about 2 weeks ago. Initially, she had simply sat quietly, reviewing the files she was assigned, rarely speaking. But now, she was proficient in various affairs. Barav couldn't find any fault or mistakes in her work and told Edith to proceed as she had suggested. Watching the young woman in front of him, Barav wondered if this was the noble cultivated by the noble education back in the Duke's mansion. He felt a deep sense of threat. What if the king decided to keep her here? The king was not married yet, and she was a legitimate daughter of a duke. Just the thought of it gave Barav a headache. Barav thought of something and spoke gravely, saying they'd run into real trouble. The food reserves in the city of Neverwinter might not last until the wheat harvest. Edith immediately thought that the influx of refugees was the cause. According to the planned consumption rate, the remaining food should last until the end of summer. The spring wheat could be harvested in mid-July. As long as they stopped accepting more refugees, the food should be sufficient. Barav shook his head, stating that they couldn't stop taking in refugees. If they abandoned them, nearby cities might experience riots. Therefore, the municipal hall couldn't let the food issue disrupt the king's arrangements. They must solve this problem. It is also the duty of the chief minister, he added, pausing before looking at Edith, questioning if she had any good ideas. Barav thought that even if Edith was very skilled in political affairs, she couldn't possibly have a complete understanding of the city of Neverwinter in just half a month. Not long after, Edith responded, saying it's not that difficult. Previously, most of the northern lands weren't suitable for wheat growing, so food would be particularly scarce every spring. Therefore, the local lords would turn their attention to the eastern territories and the Kingdom of Dawn. Barav realized something. Edith spoke casually, since they can't grow or buy enough, they can only take from others. The king's army is currently attacking Dragonfall Ridge, and Count Spear's brother, in resistance to her, has rallied quite a few local nobles. Since that's the case, as long as they get rid of them, all the gold and food hiding in their basement will be theirs. Barav said, but they are still nobles. Just then he stopped mid-sentence. After the king occupied the entire territory, they would no longer be called nobles. What puzzled Barav was how quickly Edith could accept the intention of eliminating the noble class. Even though he fully supported the king's orders, Barav himself couldn't adapt as quickly as Edith, especially considering Edith was the heir of the Duke of the North. Returning to the diplomatic building, Edith pushed open the door to her room and saw Cole flipping through a book at the desk. Cole mentioned that he bought the book at the market, which was filled with interesting pictures and stories. Noticing the smile on his sister's face, something he rarely saw, Cole couldn't help but ask if they were really not going back. Edith responded that it was only temporary and that they would return once their father replied to their letters. She believed that His Majesty would allow Cole to go back. However, when Cole asked about her own plans, Edith did not hesitate to express her desire to stay. She picked up Cole's book, showing interest in Roland's city hall, stating that she could learn a lot there. Back in the north, she could have whatever she wanted just by mentioning it to their father. However, that was more about her status and her father's willingness to listen to her suggestions, limited only within their family's territory. But here, in this city hall with hardly any nobles, and where no one cared whether Edith was the daughter of a duke from the north, everyone was judged based on their work and capabilities. Duke Calvin of the Northern Territories slammed the letter from Edith onto the desk. "This damn daughter of mine," he cursed. In his fury, Duke Calvin grabbed a glass cup from the desk, intending to smash it on the ground, but he halted mid-action. The cup was made of fine crystal glass, worth almost 3 gold. He couldn't bring himself to break such a valuable item. After some contemplation, he slowly withdrew his hand and placed the cup back on the table. He never would have expected that King Roland would directly revoke all the nobles' fiefdom rights. What shocked him even more was that his daughter, who usually managed to gain advantages for him, had readily agreed to all of His Majesty's conditions and even persuaded Duke Calvin to face reality and not resist stubbornly. Was this really his daughter? Calvin's head ached terribly. If he followed the king's order, he would lose control over the Northern Territory. He had just dealt with the Hose and Lister families, thinking he would finally have control over the entire territory, only to find himself back at square one. But what if he didn't follow His Majesty? Edith included the consequences in the letter. The letter was written in Edith's familiar tone. Calvin could even imagine the sneer on her face as she wrote this letter. Whenever she talked about failure, she would describe her own fate in an eerily calm tone. Edith wrote that she and Cole would be imprisoned forever, while Calvin's fate would be even worse. She even questioned Calvin in the letter, asking him to carefully consider how the fourth prince would treat a duke's daughter who couldn't fight back. Edith could easily list hundreds of humiliating methods that would excite any man. Perhaps, once the fourth prince grew tired of her, she would be discarded, who knows where Roland would send her, and Calvin would lose his daughter forever. The more Calvin read, the angrier he became, especially as Edith had the audacity to threaten him, stating that Calvin and his knights wouldn't last half a day against Roland's army. He could even picture the expression on his daughter's face as she wrote the letter. Although her tone was somewhat exaggerated, he couldn't deny the possibility of her words, having heard of the fourth prince's notorious reputation. With these thoughts in mind, the Duke gradually calmed down. Edith had also written about her observations in the border town, the weapons, technology, economy, and political system. In the end, she suggested that Calvin should send a formal letter to His Majesty, expressing the Northern Territory's submission. With a deep sigh, Calvin carefully put away the letter and spread out a new sheet of blank paper. Since Edith had made her decision, he had no choice but to trust her plan and write a sincere letter to King Roland, pledging allegiance to the new royal capital. However, as a duke, he needed to make one final effort in his own way. If he could tightly bind the interests of their two families together, Calvin would undoubtedly feel much more at ease. For instance, he arranged for his daughter to become the queen. While in the Dragon Fall Ridge, a shell struck the city wall of Dragon Fall Ridge. The commander in charge was Axe, looking through his binoculars, saw a huge crack appear on the stone wall. The 152mm naval artillery had already pierced through the city gate and the northern section of the city wall. Now, they were just waiting for the last entrance to launch a full-scale assault. A soldier atop the lookout post shouted, "There's movement at the city gate, they seem to be assembling horses and knights." Vaynor approached, asking whether they should adjust the naval gun's aim. Axe shook his head. He was not concerned about facing the enemy knights head-on. Turning to Spear, he said, "After this charge, there probably won't be many knights left within the territory." Spear calmly replied, "Since they decided to stand with her brother, these people are no longer her knights. Let them pay the price for their betrayal." Axe nodded, paused for a moment, and then asked how Spear planned to deal with Redwyn. His Majesty had mentioned in a confidential letter that, except for Miss Spear's relatives, all the rebelling nobles of Dragonfall Ridge should be sent to the city of Neverwinter. As for the Redwyn, Roland planned to leave him to Spear's judgment. A hint of hesitation flashed across Spear's face. She clearly had not made a decision yet. Without pressing her further, Axe turned his attention back to the lookout post, where the observer suddenly shouted, "The enemy is coming!" A group of fully armed knights charged out of the shattered city gate on horseback. If Duke Ryan's attack on the border town with his knight order could still pose a slight threat to the First Army a year ago, now they stood no chance. The vanguard battalion was already prepared at the dock, divided into 3 squads, each rushing towards one of the 3 breaches. Each squad was equipped with bolt-action rifles and 2 heavy machine guns. Soon, the battle to recapture Dragon Fall Ridge had officially begun. In less than an hour, the battle was over. The First Army had taken control of the castle, and the church had not made an appearance. All the supplies in the chapel had been completely removed, and the priest's whereabouts were unknown. The nobles were bound and taken captive. As the soldiers moved towards the bedroom, they captured Redwin, who was still shouting loudly, insisting he was the Lord of Dragon Fall Ridge and demanding to be treated as such. Spear looked at her younger brother, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "What benefits does being a lord bring to Redwin? He and their third brother neither understand how to manage state affairs nor have any knowledge of trades. Even if Redwin sits in this position, he is just handing over his power to other vassals and ministers." Spear wonders why Redwin trusts his own sister less than an outsider. Redwin shouted stubbornly, calling Spear a witch. Saying Spear was just a bastard adopted by his father. Spear was stunned. Redwin continued to shout, claiming Spear was just a mistake their father had made when he was young, and Spear didn't truly bear their family's name. According to him, Redwin was the one who should rightfully inherit the family. Spear was uncertain whether Redwin was telling the truth or not, and sensing that the situation was taking a turn for the worse, Axe was about to intervene. However, Spear coldly looked at Redwin and said, "So, you are not my brother either. In that case, Redwin should receive the punishment he deserves." Having said that, Spear turned and walked towards the main gate, instructing Axe to send Redwin to the city of Neverwinter, stating that Redwin had lost his sanity and perhaps the coal mines were the place he belonged. Redwin continued to shout, but Spear remained unswayed. Looking over Dragon Fall Ridge, she thought to herself, hoping that this land would be better governed under Roland's rule. In the city of Neverwinter, heavy rain was pouring down, with dense raindrops hitting the glass windows, creating a pitter-patter sound, accompanied by flashes of lightning. The view outside became blurry and indistinct. Roland was standing in front of the window, gazing into the hazy city under the rain. A song continued to linger in his ears. He reminisced about the drama premiere 3 days ago. The effect was astonishing when paired with Echo's ability. The audience of 5,000 people, including Roland himself, felt a deep sense of awe emanating from their hearts. This was the power of the resonance song. Lost in thought, Roland was suddenly brought back to reality when the office door was knocked. Barav entered the room. Ever since the Plate City of Love was performed, many residents have been flocking to the city hall to apply for housing rentals and purchase their own homes. There has also been a significant increase in marriages. Roland commended Barav for his good work and emphasized the need to continue expanding the recruitment of migrants and refugees. A sufficient population is crucial for the development of the city of Neverwinter. Scroll was called over, and Roland poured a cup of tea for her. He expressed his desire to expand the scope of education to include the refugees who had just arrived in the city of Neverwinter. Scroll thought for a moment and then candidly stated that it might be challenging to achieve this at the moment. They had a shortage of teaching staff and classrooms, which made it difficult to cater to everyone's needs. Roland proposed a suggestion to alleviate the pressure on the teachers and enable self-learning. He explained that they could conduct a public class once a week to teach the basics of reading and writing. For the rest of the time, the students could use picture books with phonetic annotations to practice on their own. There would be no exams and no mandatory attendance, it would all depend on the individual's initiative. Scroll pondered for a moment, saying, if that's the case, without someone looking after them, it would be impressive if 1 in 10 people managed to learn on their own. Roland smiled, he just wants to give everyone a chance. There will always be those who are not satisfied with a mundane, low-paying job and who aspire to reach their goals more quickly. To prevent these people from taking the wrong path, they must guide them to self-improvement in the right way. If they want to secure stable housing and escape a life of poverty and toil, teaching themselves to read and write is a good option. Once they take the initiative to self-learn. This method can also help those to join the city's development sooner. In the witch's residence. Wendy woke up to find that the heavy rain that had lasted all night had finally stopped. Yawning and stretching, she got out of bed, pushed open the window, and then returned to the bedside to pinch the cheek of Nightingale, who responded with a muffled snort and buried her face in the pillow. Wendy shook her head with a smile and then went to have breakfast by herself. The Witch Union had never set a fixed time for getting up, so everyone tended to trickle in for breakfast at their own pace. Lightning and Maisie were always the first, followed by people like Anna, Agatha, and Lucia. Wendy fell somewhere in the middle. Nightingale was always the last to get up, influenced by His Majesty's love of sleeping in. Unless there was a pressing matter, Roland wouldn't start dealing with official duties until the sun was high in the sky, and Nightingale had picked up this habit. Despite once being one of the most vigilant and sharp members back in the Witches' Association, always alert to the slightest hint of trouble, her habits had changed. Surprisingly, Wendy didn't see this as a bad thing. After finishing her breakfast, she went to the first floor of the Witch Building. As soon as she entered the building, Ling greeted her, followed by a few girls of similar age. Wendy said good morning to the three little girls, sat down at the office desk, and then asked about the sales of the first volume of the Witch Diary. Ling happily reported that it was very popular. Another girl reported that they had sold around 60 copies in the last week, and at this rate, the initially printed 1,000 copies would be sold out in another half a month. Wendy was somewhat surprised to hear this result. After all, as a purely entertaining book that neither fills the stomach nor aids in studies and with a rather high price, it was incredible that it sold so well. The idea had originally come from Roland, and seeing its popularity, Wendy felt greatly encouraged. She couldn't wait to spread out her paper and pen, beginning to brainstorm the content for the next picture book. With a smile, Wendy said that the next book would feature Echo as the main character. She asked the three little girls what they thought of the title Echo, the Silver Moon Princess from the far south, a land of raging sands and underground flames. The three girls' eyes sparkled as they exclaimed, "That's amazing!" Wendy then told them that after King Roland reclaimed the southern territory, everyone would have the chance to see what Echo's homeland was like. This was Wendy's job, to promote the witches, allowing everyone to have a better understanding of witches. Echo had already become a hit with the Starflower Troupe, and her immersive music had won the actors' unanimous praise. Evelyn had opened a bar, primarily offering uniquely flavored mixed spirits and cocktails. Wendy had heard that Hummingbird would also be joining the City Hall, becoming the deputy minister of the construction department, making her the second witch to become a City Hall official after Scroll. Everyone was working hard, building the city of Neverwinter, while gradually making the citizens accept the witches' existence, seeing them as equals. The day Roland had promised, Wendy felt, was now within reach. In the City of Dawn, at midnight, in the palace garden, Otto and Oro sneaked behind a massive rock, with Otto feeling a bit nervous. Knowing this is the king's bedroom. Oro rolled his eyes, saying this was Otto's idea. Why is he chickening out now? He recalled how, a few days ago, Otto had even dared to probe Lord Quinn about Andrea's current situation, and they both thought Lord Quinn's gaze was as if he wanted to arrest them on the spot. If it weren't for the fact that they had been Andrea's playmates when they were kids, they might have been in big trouble. The news that Lord Quinn had told them was astonishing. Since the king had fallen ill, the crown prince had been frequently meeting with an alchemist in the palace, even asking visitors who came to inquire about the illness to leave. Lord Quinn had caught a glimpse of the alchemist, saying she was a young woman, shrouded in a black veil. Hearing this, Otto couldn't help but think of the church. If it hadn't been for his trip to the border town, he might not have made such a connection. But after meeting Roland and learning about how the church secretly cultivated witches called the Pure Ones, in an attempt to subvert the kingdoms and amass power for the divine war, the two of them pried open the secret passage, their secret meeting place from their childhood gatherings. Otto remarked that back then, they were only 10 years old, and if His Majesty found out, he would have just scolded them. But now, breaking in without permission, he had no idea what His Majesty might think. Aro took out a glass bottle from his waist pouch, opened the lid, and poured the amber liquid onto the railing, instantly dissolving the iron bars. The two entered the passage, and at the end of the secret tunnel was the back of the fireplace in the king's bedroom. They pressed their eyes to the cracks to see inside. The fireplace was directly opposite a large bed, on which the king lay. Prince Enpian paced back and forth beside the bed, his expression filled with anxiety. "You guys are late," Enpian spoke irritably. The blonde woman in front of him bowed and replied, "There were some issues on the way, which caused a delay." The woman in black veils responded coldly, "There's no need to inform him. Just help him wake his father up." This was no other than Isabella and Black Veil. Isabella took out something from her sleeve, smiling, telling Black Veil to not say that. They still need the prince's help. She took out a green bottle. The prince tried to reach out and take it, but Black Veil stopped him. She reminded the prince of their agreement. The medicine needs to be fed by her personally to be effective. And as part of their exchange, an Enpian must fulfill the Pope's requests, she stated. Hearing this, Otto and Oro, hiding behind the fireplace, were shocked. After hearing the word Pope, they then understood that these two were sent by the church. Black Veil sat at the bedside, questioning the prince, "Why hasn't the road to the Wolfheart Kingdom been closed after a whole month? Why are there still so many refugees entering the country recently?" Enpian clenched his fists, responding, "If the refugees are forbidden from entering, many will die on the road because there are no cities nearby to provide them with food." The woman interrupted impatiently, "What does that have to do with the church? What does their death have to do with Enpian? He should be focusing on the king." She then questioned if Enpian was thinking of breaking their agreement. Enpian clearly hesitated. After a long while, he finally said, he will completely close all of the routes within a week. But if refugees try to cross the mountains instead of using the roads, he can't do anything about that. Isabella nodded in agreement. Then, Black Veil took the bottle, took a small sip, and bent over onto the bed, delivering the medicine into the king's mouth. After a moment, she raised her head, wiped her mouth, and said that should do it. "The king will wake up in half an hour, just like before." The prince asked, "Does the medicine have to be fed mouth to mouth?" Black Veil affirmed, "Yes, and it must be fed by her. As long as Enpian keeps his promise, the king will recover fully and be even healthier than before." As Black Veil and Isabella prepared to leave, Prince Enpian suddenly asked if they were witches. They halted in their tracks. He slowly suggested that the requirement for only her to be fed the medicine could only be explained by the magical power of a witch, adding that although it was incredible to think there could be witches within the church, their actions were no different from those of demons. Isabella laughed softly, asking if that was all he wanted to say. Prince Enpian then shouted, "Come out!" This startled Otto and Oro, who were still hidden, but they then saw over a dozen fully armored guards wearing Stone of God punishments emerging from a wardrobe and under the bed, swiftly surrounding the two pure ones. Isabella looked around disdainfully. Black Veil shook her head, commenting that the church obviously hadn't made a strong enough impression on Enpian. Prince Enpian roared, perhaps revealing the fury he had kept suppressed for so long. He declared that even though the gods' punishment army they had shown him before might be incredibly powerful, they were not present at that moment. He then ordered the guards to seize the two women. Isabella laughed softly and asked if the witch they had encountered on the road had also been arranged by him. Enpian, his voice filled with suppressed anger, dismissed it as a common trick used by the rats. He pointed out that without the protection of God's punishment soldiers, the two of them were no different from ordinary people when faced with the Stone of God punishments. He then demanded that they hand over the medicine. Isabella sighed. looking at the expressions of the two women. Anpian, completely provoked by their nonchalant attitudes, watched as his guards, armed with shields embedded with the stone of God punishments, advanced toward the two witches. However, before they could reach them, the guards suddenly turned their swords on themselves, slicing into their own necks. Blood splattered as the guards fell one after another. Prince Anpian was trembling uncontrollably as if he had witnessed something utterly horrifying. The momentum and fury that had fueled him just moments ago drained away rapidly. Soon after, a wet patch appeared in the middle of his trousers as he lost control of his bladder, with urine trickling down his legs. Black Veil steadily approached the prince, step by step. Otto and Oro, hidden in the secret chamber, were eager to rush out, but the mechanisms to open it could only be operated from inside the room. Isabella suggested not to take things too far. With a snap of her fingers, Black Veil intending to give the prince a lesson, he suddenly seemed to snap out of a trance and sat down on the ground, shivering and scooting backward. He asked, confused, even with all these stone of God punishments. Anpian stuttered out a question, wondering how the two witches could possibly still use their powers. Isabella smiled faintly, explaining that it was because they were the pure ones. Isabella then suggested that the prince should adhere to their agreement earnestly. His father would eventually be safe and sound, and once the church took over Grey Castle, the prince could become one of them. Even if the Kingdom of Dawn is taken over by the church, the prince can still enjoy a life of wealth and comfort. His people can be spared from the suffering of war. Why bother making these foolish moves now? As she left the room, she turned back and added, "The prince should clean up this place. The king will wake up soon, and he probably wouldn't want to see his bedroom in such a state." Otto felt his back soaked with cold sweat. The pure ones, who were not afraid of the stone of God's punishments, along with the church's plan to first conquer Grey Castle and then take over the Kingdom of Dawn, all sent chills down his spine. The church has long seen the four great kingdoms as meat in their mouths. This is exactly what His Majesty Roland said. Oro wondered aloud what they should do. Oro thought this was way beyond what they can handle. They must inform their father and Lord Quinn. However, Otto was skeptical. What good will tell them to do? They are dealing with people who are not even afraid of stone of God punishments. Otto closed his eyes and said, he knows someone who can deal with them. They need to go to the Grey Castle ambassador immediately and pass on what they've heard to His Majesty Roland Wimbledon. In the city of Neverwinter, in the border town, Roland was reading a reply letter from Duke Calvin with a smile. Nightingale appeared behind him and asked what he was laughing at. Roland found Duke Calvin's reply letter quite amusing. First, the Duke inquired about when Roland was going to hold the coronation ceremony so he could prepare to come and congratulate him. At the end of the letter, the Duke proposed a marriage alliance, praising his daughter Edith's beauty and talent on an entire page, claiming that she could handle both domestic and foreign affairs perfectly, making her the best queen candidate. Nightingale took the letter and frowned after reading a few lines. She then turned around asking Roland isn't going to agree, right? Roland, of course, had no intention of agreeing. Jockling said if Edith is really as outstanding as the letter describes, he'd be afraid to let her into the castle. Of course, this was a joke. Roland did not need a political marriage to stabilize his throne. Nightingale sighed in relief because she knew Roland was telling the truth. Suddenly, a flying messenger bird flew through the open window and landed on the desk. It was a secret letter from the old capital, indicating that there was news from the City of Dawn. Roland fed the bird some fish jerky and opened the confidential letter. It seems Ambassador York is quite competent, he commented. However, his expression changed abruptly as he read the letter. The first sentence of the letter gave him a big shock. The Dawn Palace has been infiltrated by the Pure One. Their abilities can ignore Stone of God punishments. The Crown Prince tried to resist, but the guards, under the control of the Pure One, committed suicide with their own swords. The church intends to attack Grey Castle first. Witnessing all this were Otto and Oro, and the three great families hoped to get Roland's help. After a while, the two of them watched the secret letter burn, feeling a heavy weight in their hearts. A witch immune to the effects of the Stone of God punishments. As far as they knew, only the extraordinary witches could achieve this. Apart from that, there were the high-ranking demons known as magic slayers. Roland took a deep breath, suddenly realizing that he had to make significant adjustments to his plan to reclaim the southern territory. Quickly, Roland convened a strategic discussion meeting in the castle's room. Axe suggested replacing the soldiers of the First Army stationed at Dragonfall Ridge with newly trained recruits, as they should have no problem dealing with those nobles. The First Army needed to be concentrated together to defend against the church. Roland agreed and turned to look at the map, realizing they were now facing two issues: first, when the enemy would attack, and second, where the enemy would start their attack. Roland roughly recounted the contents of the secret letter, wanting to hear everyone's suggestions. Barif spoke first, stating that no matter where they appeared, the enemy would first have to pass through the kingdom's northern territories, all of which were under the jurisdiction of Duke Calvin right now. He suggested letting Miss Edith deliver this message to her father. Edith stood up and said that while it was indeed necessary to dispatch people to monitor all of the possible routes, it didn't mean that was a good method. They needed to act quickly to buy enough time for Roland. Roland shifted his gaze towards Edith, who confidently responded, "Send people to Hermes." Carter frowned, displaying his concern and curiosity about Edith's plan. Carter expressed his doubts about the efficacy of sending people over to the holy city of the church, and Petrov added that it would be difficult to blend in since the local population is full of fanatic followers of the church. Edith smiled and explained that there was no need to enter the holy city, it would suffice to find merchants nearby and have a good chat with them. Edith slowly walked up to the front, her finger pointing towards the map as she spoke with a serious tone. The terrain of Hermes is extremely unique, creating a gentle slope with its mountain ranges. The new holy city is situated atop a plateau, but the environment here is incredibly harsh. While the natural barriers can help the church fend off demonic beasts, this place itself is not suitable for living, let alone farming. Edith paused for a moment before continuing her explanation. This means that they must rely on external resources, especially food. Every autumn, dozens of caravans from the four kingdoms arriving each day, all for the sole purpose of supplying the new holy city. She then concluded, in other words, if the church planned to dispatch their army, the merchants would certainly notice. According to the changes in the scale of material transportation, they can then estimate the time of their deployment. Edith's tone was firm and displayed confidence, which was exceedingly rare among women of this era. Everyone in the room was surprised. Roland pondered inwardly. It seems that Calvin's description of Edith in his letter wasn't entirely an exaggeration. Edith expressed a deep interest in Roland's First Army's tactics, eager to understand how Roland's troops had managed to breach the old royal capital within a single day. She also hoped to learn through observation, aiming to better assist Roland in the upcoming battles. Roland agreed and instructed Axe to make the necessary arrangements. Sylvie's expression revealed her deep concerns. She believed this might be an exceptionally tough battle and suggested notifying Tilly, hoping that the witch from Slumbering Isle could lend Roland a helping hand. Roland couldn't help but smile bitterly upon hearing Sylvie's suggestion. The situation on Slumbering Isle was not much better than his own. There had been no news since Roland informed Tilly about the Blood Fawn. If Tilly were to bring the witches to aid him without resolving the internal conflicts, Slumbering Isle might fall into greater turmoil. However, Roland also knew that going against the Pure Ones with their strange abilities, witches indeed provided the most effective countermeasure.